No travel course would be complete without telling you something about the geography of China. Now, I myself have lived in China for several years, but I normally go back every year and I pick a new province to travel in. So I've done a lot of traveling myself in China. I visited all but 6 of the Chinese provinces and municipalities. And when you do something like that, you are exposed to the enormous diversity in landscape in China that I want to talk about in this lesson. So every trip basically is very different if you plan it correctly. So one of the important things to keep in mind when we're talking about China as a country and about China as a geographical region is that China is the world's 3rd largest country as far as landmass is concerned. Only Russia and Canada are bigger than China. The US, if you include some of the water areas, is slightly bigger than China, but as far as land mass is concerned, China is the 3rd largest country in the world. And if you compare it to Europe, it's almost as large as Europe. As a matter of fact, only differs like 6% with the surface of Europe. So people that are from Europe will realize that, of course, there's a lot of differences in people, in landscape, in Europe. Even though we might call ourselves Europeans, there's very big differences between countries. You see the same thing happen in China. There's an enormous diversity in landscapes. So on one hand, you have a very dry desert. Take, for instance, the Taklamakan Desert, which is located in the province of Xinjiang. It's the 2nd largest mass of sand after the Sahara. And a bit further to the east, you'll find Donghuang, the sand dunes of Donghuang, which are also like enormous masses of sand. If you go a bit more to the east and northwards, you'll find the Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert is basically shared between Mongolia and Inner Mongolia, which is a Chinese province, but it's also one of the world's largest deserts. So on one hand, you have these very dry, very sandy places. But on the other hand, you also have enormous extensive grasslands, like for instance the grasslands of Qinghai province, which is basically the slope to the Tibetan plateau. Or you have the grasslands of Inner Mongolia, where you also find a lot of horse riders. China is also home to many very large lakes. I just mentioned Qinghai, and Qinghai has one of the biggest lakes. I actually think it's the biggest lake in China with Qinghai Lake. So again, a very diverse landscape. What you see here is probably one of my most favorite pictures of China because it tells so much. This is a picture, a 3D picture of the elevation in China. And there's a couple of things that you can see. I just talked about the Taklamakan Desert, and you can see it in this picture as the circle over here. You can also see that there's very big differences in elevation and altitude in China. On one hand, you have the Tibetan Plateau, which is one of the places that I visited and is one of my most impressive journeys that I've done. And the Tibetan Plateau goes as high as the top of Mount Everest at 8,849 meters. It's actually right at the border with Nepal. So that's the highest point that you can reach in China. And overall, I think the Tibetan Plateau varies between like 3,000 and 5,000 meters. So you will, if you arrive there, you will notice how thin the air actually is. But if you go down from the Tibetan Plateau, and like I said, you first go through Qinghai province and you arrive in Xinjiang, then the lowest point in China is located in Turpan. In the Turpan Desert, they grow a lot of grapes there because the climate is very good for grape growing. And the Turpan Basin is the world's second deepest impression after the Dead Sea, which is of course located between Israel and Jordan. So this is the big difference in elevation in China. But there's more that you can tell from this picture. One thing is that the lowest lands without a lot of mountains are located in the east. And because of this, because of all of the elevation and the mountains, not a lot of land in China can be used for agriculture. Only about 15% of China's land can be cultivated. And if you take into account that China needs to feed 20% of the world's population, but only has 10% of real arable land, then you can see the challenges for the Chinese people. As a matter of fact, many farmers in China have like a very small patch of land where they grow some crops. You won't find the really extremely big agricultural companies and expenses as you'll see in the United States. No, it's most of the time simply not possible. What you'll also see is most of the arable land, most of the land that can be used for agriculture, is found in the east of the country, where, like I said, the land is more flat, and it's also closer to the many rivers that China is home to. So the land is much more fertile there. If you, for instance, look at the Tibetan plateau, there's not a lot that you can grow there. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons for the sky burials that they do in China, where they don't burn people, they don't bury people, they actually chop them up and feed them to scavenger birds, is because there is so little wood, and it would be a waste to burn people or to bury them in a casket. So this is something that has an impact on the local habits as well. But you also find, and we've talked about this in a lesson of diversity in the basic China course as well, is that the population density in the east is far higher, which is of course partially based by the fact that the arable land is much better in that region. But especially if you go to the east coast, where a lot of the industry is located, a lot of people even migrated from slightly inland provinces like Sichuan or Henan to the factories to work there. So that's why the population density is also much higher than in other parts of China. Now, like I said, China is home to many different mountains. One of the most famous mountains and ranges is the Yellow Mountains, Huangshan, which a lot of Chinese people visit as one of the touristic highlights of their country. But there's also many holy mountains that you will find, mountains that are connected to Buddhism or Taoism throughout the country and are also visited for that specific reason. Whereas if you go more southwards to more tropical and warmer regions, you will find amazing landscape like the karst mountains and the karst hills of Guangxi, around the area, for instance, of Yangshuo. And Yangshuo is one of the highlights of China to visit. There's more, there's much more. There's many national parks that you can find in China. I'll mention two specific ones. Jiayuguan, which is a park which is really impressive, has beautiful lakes and lots of waterfalls. It was hit by an earthquake a couple of years ago. It's been recently reopened, but it's one of the most impressive and beautiful sites in China. Whereas those people who have seen the movie Avatar might know those very like finger-like mountains that stick into the air. And that movie was inspired by Jiayuguan. And Jiayuguan has these enormous mountains that stick out. And you can go up with a glass elevator and walk around on the different plateaus and admire that landscape. So there's many more national parks like these in China. What you also have is extremes in weather, and we'll talk a bit more about this in the climate and weather lesson that Jessica is doing for this course. But in the south you have Hainan, which is basically a tropical island. And a lot of Chinese people also go there to have a beach vacation. Whereas in the north, in the region of Dongbei, which literally means the northeast, it can be extremely cold. And in one of the capitals of the three provinces that you'll find there, in Harbin, they have an ice festival. And it gets like minus 40 degrees there, so they can make these beautiful ice sculptures. So again, more about this enormous difference in climate in another lesson. China is also home to some of the world's longest rivers. And several of these rivers actually originate in Tibet. and then flow down to lower lands and even into other countries. If you, for instance, take the Mekong River, it originates in China, but it feeds most of the people in the southeast of Asia. So if you travel in countries like Thailand, you will, and Thailand and Cambodia, you will come across the Mekong River again, and you can keep in mind that this water all flow down from the Tibetan Plateau in China. Two other very important rivers in China are the Yellow River, and most of the civilization in China actually grew around the Yellow River. And you have the Yangtze River. And the Yangtze River is also well known for the Three Gorges Dam, an enormous water-powered energy complex that was built right in the middle of this river. So, to sum up, there's a lot of very impressive landscape in China that you can visit, and a lot of diversity. But there's also, of course, another reason why people go to visit China, and that's the history. It's a country that has, according to some 5,000 years of civilization, and the actual origin of China goes back at least 2,000 years. So there's a lot of things to see in China, and especially around the former capitals like Beijing, Xi'an. Xi'an used to be called Chang'an, and that's where the Qin emperor basically built what we currently know as China. Or Nanjing also was a capital for some time. You will find a lot of historical sites around these places. So if you go, for instance, to Beijing, you can find the Forbidden City there, where the emperor lived. You might know it from the Lost Emperor movie. You'll also find the Temple of Heaven there, a very impressive round temple. And the Summer Palace, which is personally my favorite place in Beijing, because it's very diverse with lakes and pavilions and little temples. So a lovely place to hang out on a summer's day. Of course, I couldn't do a lesson without mentioning the Great Wall. And the Great Wall is actually not one wall, but it's different patches of walls in different places, sometimes connected by mountains that were enough to keep the barbarians from the north outside. A very easy thing to do is to hop on a train and visit the Great Wall from Beijing to Badaling. Badaling is maybe not the most authentic place, but it's relatively easy to reach. If you have your own transport or you hire some transport, and I'll talk more about these things in the transportation lesson, you can also visit more realistic places like, for instance, Jinshanling, which I visited in 2014 and was really impressive. And if you really go to travel in China, you can go to the extreme western part of the wall, which is a fort called Jiayuguan. And that's located in the western part of Gansu. That's the actual end of the wall. On the other end, you can also visit a place where the wall actually goes into the sea. That's the most eastern part of the wall. In Xi'an is a city that's very close to my heart because I lived there for a couple of years. That is, like I said, where the Chinese country, as we know it today, originated. And you'll have old city walls there, and you have the world famous terracotta warriors that were found close to the city, that you can also visit by going there by different forms of public transport. Around China you will find many different Buddhist grottos. Buddhism was, in the time of the Silk Road, getting very popular. And you have the Mogao grottos, you have the Longmen grottos, you have the Yungang grottos, all around different places in China. So one of the big tourist attractions. Whereas you might also be very interested in Tibetan Buddhism. And of course I mentioned Tibet, it's not one of the most easy places to visit, but you will find Tibetan temples all the way across China. You can find them, of course, in Tibet, but you'll find them all the way from Shigatse to Chengde, which is north of Beijing. And even in the middle, in places like Gansu, in Laprang temple, and there's also many in Sichuan province and some in parts of Yunnan province, so you can find that across China as well. One of my personal favorite travels was traveling to Gansu, not only because of the different things I mentioned, like the Jiayuguan fortress and the sand dunes at Dunhuang, but there's a lot of diversity. You can really see that people from the Middle East and people from India traveled through the Silk Road to Xi'an and left their different influences in food, in the way that people live. So you will find many different types of minorities there as well. In China, you will probably, as if you go there for business, you will visit some of the big metropolises. And some of these metropolises actually grew to become very big in the last 40 years. So if you take Shanghai, if you take Shenzhen, Chongqing or Hong Kong, those all became very big metropolises over the last couple of decades, especially the first three. And they contrast very starkly with some of the more old towns and the places that I personally find very interesting to visit. So you have these tiny little old towns, sometimes with a city wall, but with lots of historical sites like Pingyao in Shanxi province. You have Hongchun in Xidi in Anhui province. You have the Tulou buildings in Fujian, and a place like Fenghuang, also called Phoenix City in Hunan. Totally different from the rest of the country. Now, a thing that I need to mention is that if you do go to some of these places, do remember that domestic tourism in China has become very booming over the last couple of years. Now that people have more money to spend, they also want to see their own country. And since there's so much to see, a lot of Chinese people are traveling in their own country. Try to avoid visiting places like these during public holidays. But there's another thing that you need to keep in mind as well. As these tourist attractions get very popular with Chinese people, they also adapt to their personal taste. And you will find that there will be a lot of restaurant and tourist shops, so some of them get a bit too commercialized for some of our personal taste and take away a bit of the authenticity. So some of these domestic tourist attractions can turn into tourist traps like this. So I do advise you, if you are a more adventurous traveler, to seek out go off the beaten track and seek out the places that are maybe not so much visited. And one of the places that I, for instance, visited is a very small town called Demon, where you have much more feeling of authenticity of being out in the countryside in old style life in China. So it's a nice contrast with those big metropolis cities that I talked about earlier. One thing that we always stress is keep in mind, I've shown you the diversity in landscape. I told you about different very modern and very old places you can visit in China. If you go to China, this is China, but this is also China. This is China, but this is also China. You can go to places in China like this, or like this, or this. So as you can see, there's not really one China. It's much too diverse. Just like Europe has many differences between countries and landscapes, the same thing applies to China. So I do advise you to go out of the big cities and explore the country, because there's so much to see and to experience. So not just for businessmen that might be visiting a remote place where they are doing business with, but also as a tourist and an adventurous traveler, there's a lot to see in China. And in this travel course, we'll help you with lots of practical advice and tips for your traveling in China. So we'll definitely see you again, I think, for one of the next lessons. And thank you for watching, and I hope you found this interesting and helpful. Bye bye.